In 1945, Britain was celebrating victory in the Second World War. People were cheering in the streets, singing, hugging. But where was Winston Churchill, the man who had saved their country? He was sitting in his home, silently drinking whiskey, and could not believe what was happening. While the nation was celebrating, he had just lost everything. In the election that year, Churchill lost by a landslide. The party he led won only 36% of the vote. People chose new leaders, forgetting who had protected them during the worst years. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a humiliation. In this video, we'll explore why the British rejected their leader immediately after the victory and what Churchill himself said about his defeat. Young Winston Churchill dreamed of a military career, but failed the entrance exams to the academy twice. It would seem, what kind of future legend is he? If he had given up then, the world would never have known his name. But he didn't. The third time, Churchill still entered, and then went to serve in the army. He went to the hottest spots: India, Sudan, South Africa. Not just fought, but also wrote articles about the battles, for which he became famous. It was thanks to these texts that he became popular and entered politics. Churchill's career developed rapidly, but the falls were also loud. In the First World War, he proposed an operation in Gallipoli, and it ended in disaster. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed. He was blamed for the failure and lost his post. To save his reputation, he volunteered to go to the front. A politician going into the trenches himself was unusual. But even after the war, he was not taken seriously. In the 1930s, Churchill was politically isolated. He was seen as a failure behind the times. He warned of Hitler's growing power, but no one listened. It seemed his career was over. But then something happened that changed everything. The Second World War broke out. And the man who was thought to be a political corpse was suddenly the only one who could save Britain. May 1940. Europe is collapsing. Hitler is taking country after country, and British soldiers are fleeing France in despair. The British army is almost destroyed. Only 338,000 out of 400,000 soldiers can be saved. People are in panic. The government is discussing a terrible option: to negotiate with Hitler. Many politicians believe that resistance is futile and it is better to surrender while Britain is still intact. But Churchill was of a different opinion. On May 10, 1940, at a time when the country was about to lose, he became Prime Minister. His first speech to Parliament was short and stiff. Then he said, "I can only offer you blood, toil, tears, and sweat." But even he realized that the country was in a terrible position. Britain was left alone against the Nazis. The USSR had not yet entered the war, and the US was not going to intervene. In secret from everyone, Churchill prepares a backup plan: the evacuation of the government in Canada. He called it a desperation plan, because if it had to be used, it would mean the end of Britain. This plan was kept top secret, because if it got out, it would break the morale of the people. But he was not going to give up. He knew that if Britain fell, Hitler would win the war. And he was doing everything he could to make sure that didn't happen. Churchill worked 16 to 18 hours a day, hardly slept, and constantly made the most difficult decisions. To cope with the load, he drank alcohol every day. Whiskey in the morning, champagne in the afternoon, cognac in the evening. He claimed that alcohol helped him make difficult decisions. Historians dispute how true this is, but the fact remains that he drank and kept working. His schedule included mandatory midday baths. Right in the hot water, he could make state decisions and even dictate orders to his secretaries. Churchill literally lived the war. He was not afraid to fly to the USSR and the United States, even when it was dangerous. He was the first to meet Stalin in 1942 and later convinced Roosevelt to enter the war. When the Battle of Britain began, the country was under endless bombing. 40,000 civilians died, cities were destroyed, but Churchill instilled in people that they had no right to surrender. He said, "We will fight on the beaches, we will fight in the streets, we will never surrender." These words inspired the nation. People believed him even when there was no hope left. But in 1945, when the war ended, the nation suddenly turned its back on him, and it was a most unexpected betrayal for Churchill. The summer of 1945. The war is over. Britain has won. The people are rejoicing. It seems that now Winston Churchill should remain the leader of the country. After all, it was he who saved it. But something incredible happens. In the election, his party suffers a crushing defeat. People vote for Labour, those who promise new jobs, social security, and change. And they don't want Churchill in power anymore. When he learned the results, he sat silently in his chair, took out a cigar and smoked. Not one word, not one emotion. Just smoke and silence. Churchill could not understand how his own people could do this to him. He wasn't just unsupported, he was banished from politics. Churchill became depressed. He admitted, "It was the worst blow of my life." He lost not only power, but the meaning of life. He would later say it was a stab in the back, and the country had gone mad. And perhaps he was right. After all, without him, Britain might not have lived to see this day. Why did the nation reject its hero? Simple. Churchill was a symbol of war, and the war was over. People no longer needed a fighter. They needed a builder of a new life. But that's not the end of his story. He would come back, but as a different man. And what happened next surprised even his enemies. After the 1945 election defeat, it seemed that Churchill's career was over, but he had no intention of quitting. 6 years later, in 1951, he was elected Prime Minister again. He seemed to be back on top, but it wasn't the same Churchill. As he aged, his health deteriorated. He suffered several strokes, but hid it from the people so as not to lose power. Despite his illness, he continued to work, but was too weak to run the country. In 1955, he finally left office. After leaving, Churchill became increasingly withdrawn. He was haunted by severe depression, which he called the Black Dog. He had once inspired millions with his speeches, but in recent years he had almost stopped speaking. In 1965, at the age of 90, he passed away. Millions of people came to his funeral. He was seen off as a national hero, the same one who had once been rejected. Churchill's story shows that great men can be forgotten in their lifetime, but history still remembers them. But could he himself forgive Britain for the way it had treated him?